I'm Kevin Mims with the Invading Sea, a Florida-wide media collaborative that reports on climate change in the state. As part of that effort, we started The Business of Climate Change, a weekly interview with businessmen and women whose companies are either affected by the warming climate or address climate challenges. Today's conversation is with Andrew Stevenson, Senior Research Analyst with Voloridge Investments and advisor for the VoLo Foundation. Andrew, thanks for talking with us today.
Sure, happy to be here.
Andrew, first of all, can you briefly explain what your company does and how it relates to climate change?
Sure. So we are a hedge fund here in Jupiter, Florida. I manage a hedge fund portfolio that's directly related to climate called the Climate Change Fund. So we are creating strategies and making investment decisions around what is either happening to the climate today with respect to the damages of climate change, or how we're trying to fix the problem over time.
Got it. So, Andrew, how is climate change impacting personal finances and investments of average people? I mean, what kind of advice can you give?
Sure. So, I mean, there's sort of two things going on, right? Is that the climate itself is obviously changing pretty rapidly, and we're seeing a lot of the damages related to climate change becoming pocketbook issues, right? If you think about what happened last year, it wasn't a big year in terms of big storms. We actually had more storms than, it was a record year for the number of storms that we had. Something like on the order of about $100 billion worth of damages. About 66 of that was paid for by the insurance companies, but a lot of that comes out of the pockets of you and me. So when you think about what's happening with respect to climate change, insurance companies cover about a quarter of the damage. About half of the damage is uninsured, so that's coming out of your and my pocket when the roof comes off or your basement floods or whatever happens in that regard. And then another roughly quarter of it is spent by the federal government. So from a pocketbook issue standpoint, next year you're probably going to see your insurance premiums go up. It's a function of what happened in the last several years. But if you look at last year, one of the strangest statistics you probably haven't heard about climate change is that about 1 out of every 30 buildings was affected by climate change last year in the United States. So these are insured claims. So this is not just, there's more than that clearly, because some of them aren't insured. But if you think about that, 1 out of every 30 buildings, about 4.5 million structures had some damages to report with respect to climate change. And some of those are owned by people like you and me, and some of them are owned by businesses, but it translates into a more expensive premium for all of us from an insurance perspective next year and in the years to come. It's something on the order of 9 to 12% next year.
Andrew, your office is in South Florida. What are some of the effects of climate change that you've seen firsthand?
So obviously we've seen many big storms that have happened over the past several years. Those are having a pretty dramatic impact on how we live and, disrupting. Florida is $1 trillion economy. And so if you take a week out of that year to repair or clean up after a storm, like we saw in Texas, they had 3 days basically where their economy kind of ground to a halt. And it cost the economy of Texas about $100 billion, right, in terms of total damages. It's pretty significant. It's like 0.5% of US GDP. If you think about it in that way, it's a big number. Florida is having similar problems. So they're having to take all their power lines, sink them below ground so we can avoid the brownouts. It's obviously a pretty important thing. And again, the big problem is in the real estate sector. I would argue that the two things from an individual standpoint to be concerned about are how this is a pocketbook issue with respect to insurance premiums kind of driving up the cost of living in Florida. And, kind of the more short-term worrying thing is really the rise in heat and how our summers are getting longer, our winters are getting shorter. This is not good for young people, babies and young people in particular, or older people. And that's sort of what Florida is. We are growing young families and retired people. And when you are disadvantaging them on both ends of the spectrum, it's not so great for the kind of health and welfare of the economy going forward.
Andrew, there's been a lot of uncertainty around climate change and real estate. Do you think that 30-year mortgages will cease to exist because of sea level rise and climate change?
So, I mean, more importantly than that, right? So I think that there are forecasts that are pretty awful in terms of what you can expect to see in terms of sea level rise over the next several decades. I think that the kind of stealth problem is not so much the mortgage rate, but the insurance premiums. If you just, as an example, in 2019, the insurance industry, for every $100 they took in, they paid out about $107 in payouts for events, right? So they lost money in 2019. 2020, they took in $100 a premium, they ended up having to pay out about $121. So they're losing money on Florida as a commercial enterprise to insure homes, right? So what's happening is that means that they're going to have to increase rates and in order just to break even. So, I mean, as much as we think this is a greed factor, these guys have lost money for several years on the trot now. And what they're likely to do is raise rates to a point where they are not losing money. And that is sort of a stealth tax on real estate. Because if you think about a $300,000 home, if it costs you $1,000 to insure it when you purchase it, you turn around 2 years later, it's $3,000 to insure your home. It's like having your mortgage rate go up. And you're going from what you thought was a fixed rate of 2% to a variable rate sort of north of 4 or 5% because of this additional cost that no one wants to pay. Like, I don't know anyone who looks forward to the end of the quarter and paying their insurance premiums. So it's sort of the last thing that anyone wants to pay attention to, but it's something that's worth paying attention to in the state of Florida because of how material and how much the insurance industry is sort of failing to make a profit here. And the response from them is likely to be to raise your rates.
Okay, so you're saying that the problem really is the rise in insurance rates rather than the 30-year mortgage plan itself, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a 30-year for banks now. They're required to do a pretty detailed analysis of whether the mortgage is going to be good for 30 years. So they're spending a lot of money on data about your building to understand where it sits in the floodplain. If you step up into the building, where the building is on the property, to get an understanding to really understand what your risks are from a flood perspective. And that certainly can keep you from getting a mortgage. I'm not saying that that's not the case. It's actually law. So this is not a voluntary thing on their part. They are now required to by law. They're spending a reasonable amount of money to make sure that they do that and do it well. So you can, I still believe you will be able to get in many places 30-year mortgages, but I'm just saying that the impact is much more like a pocketbook issue from having to spend the money on insurance premiums, because it's something that's not in the price. You think about your price of your home, you kind of assume whatever the price of the different utilities when you buy it aren't going to move that much. You think about the different expenses around your house, mowing the lawn and all that kind of stuff. And all of a sudden you have this variable that could go up 3, 4, 5x on you. So it becomes, and you are required by law to have insurance on your home if you have a mortgage. So you don't have nearly the flexibility to let the grass grow for another 2 weeks out of the year, out of the month, or you just basically have to find the money and pay it. So it is something that's worth paying attention to. And from a home purchase perspective, it's something that probably gets very little attention and will be getting more attention over time, because sticker shock is a great wake-up call.
Andrew, what can the Florida legislature do to help?
Well, it's a bit of a problem, right? So you have a situation where we are a subsidized insurance market. We get a lot of our subsidy or a lot of our insurance from the national government. So we are paying a rate that's sort of below fair market prices for what we're doing. So it's a little hard to reconcile that with the marketplace and the free marketplace and all that stuff. So there's probably going to be some kind of gradual shift there, but people should not try to be buying and building in places where this is going to be a problem. So I think that from a legislative standpoint, we need to be thoughtful about things that we sanction and not try to get, make sure that building goes up and that employs people for a very short period of time. And then that building becomes a risk to the people that live there from a financial side. So the most important thing is we need to address the fact that we need to adapt to climate change. And that means thinking about which parts of the beaches and things like that we need to build up from an infrastructure perspective to keep us safe to make sure that buildings are safe, to make sure the codes are high enough that we don't have, kind of horrible events. So, I mean, it's really about kind of more boring stuff, I think, than anything, unfortunately, from the policy perspective, which is better codes, better building codes, smarter building codes, things that are going to save all of us money in the long term that may seem, slightly onerous in the short term. But if you have the better windows, you're going to get better insurance. Like there's a lot of things that you just are going to pay for down the road. It just was a better gamble 5 years or 10 years ago in terms of whether you had to pay for that. The gamble is not so great anymore. So it's a much better that we make the standards higher, make sure that people have the right tools to fight the fact that we're going to be facing more storms going forward.
Andrew, thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Sure.